Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. We're coming live today to talk about the unbundling of the American middle and the places where it broke. Please welcome back to the show and to the conversation, Mike Hathorne.
Hathorne.
Mike Hathorne.
We just talked about this. I love it.
Welcome back, Mike Hathorne.
Yeah, whatever's close, I'll answer to it.
That's right. Well, thanks for coming and thanks for spending the time with me.
Yeah.
Congratulations on your recent move to Arkansas.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. So let me put a little framing and context around this for folks if they're listening. In February, I wrote an essay on a theme over on my Substack called The Unbundling of the American Middle. And I started to discuss that the American middle class didn't disappear, it was disassembled. Not by any bad choices or generational failure, but by systems that were optimized for efficiency and liquidity and scale rather than cohesion. So what I didn't focus on during that piece intentionally was where that disassembly occurred, or maybe how deeply place itself shaped the outcome. So Mike, you graciously wrote a counterpiece and were a guest writer to that. So, to frame it, we didn't just unbundle the American middle. We built places that made stability expensive and proximity rare. So let's talk about that for a second. We got about a half an hour. We'll kind of run through a few themes. We didn't just unbundle the American middle. We built places that made stability expensive and proximity rare.
Yeah, what I've really appreciated the article that you wrote because it put me in a position of trying to describe it within the context of my book. And the approach that I took was to look at it from a spatial platform. It's very apparent when you pay close attention to it that part of what has happened based on the context that you provided was that our development patterns have been part of this unbundling process. And in that unbundling process, we've done things spatially that has done a few things that have led to, in my opinion, very negative consequences. When you what a neighborhood or a community should be and what its components are, it really ought to be based on the needs of an individual's daily life. And what has occurred over time is those components that make up our daily life have been separated from each other and spread out. And in doing that, there's an underlying current of having disassembled the social relationships that occurred naturally before that unbundling. The other thing that I thought about quite a bit was it actually stemmed from some points that you made, was this idea of the conversion of time to money back into time and the dilution that occurs as you make those transitions. Because part of what we've done is we've unbundled things is we have forced an overinvestment in the conversion of time to money. Time used to be a lot more protected when our communities and our neighborhoods were structured based on daily needs. And what I mean by that is, it's where, having proximity to home, to work, to where you shop, to where you go to school, to healthcare. All of those things have just been scattered to the wind.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing that, it forces this investment into the automobile. So you've gone from human scale to auto scale, which means that you have to work on this conversion of time into money for the purposes of the car, which then force another conversion back into the time investment that's associated with then reconnecting to all these things. And it's done significant harm. And I think that's something that we have to acknowledge, especially as we try to put the pieces back together, which I think is kind of the crux of what you and I are looked at within the realm of our articles as you pair them together, is how do we fix this problem so that we don't keep doing the same thing and just keep doing it in perpetuity.
Yeah. And so much of it is the relationship with time, and that we're seeing that with everything. Our social contract and agreement with time has changed. And we need to also revisit our relationship with time, the time of the commute or the time missed with kids, the opportunity cost of time, the suburban drive versus potentially living in something smaller and having walkability or access to family activities or being able to make that community meeting because you do have the time, right?
Yep. Yep. That's yeah, it completely unplugs us. And so instead of a collective that's based on community, it becomes very singular. And the way that you have to recapture the time that basically has to go into the investment of being spread out, we tend to isolate it. It forces isolation. Instead of making the community meeting, it's like, man, I'm beyond tired because I've had to do these other things which have sapped me of my willingness to plug in. And so you go home and try and decompress from all of the stress of the day.
Yeah. There's a section in here I want to read in your counter writing, in your guest writing. It says a functional middle requires what I would call cohesive, walkable settlement patterns, places where daily needs are nearby, where households can right size over time without leaving their social fabric, where kids can gain autonomy without chauffeuring, and where the elderly can age with dignity without isolation. That's not a lifestyle preference. That's risk management. Let's double click on that.
Well, yeah, you think about what that means in terms of, and what you just went through was an identification of basically all the consequences associated with the pattern that we're living in. And it's forced, it's forced the young, the old, and the poor to really compromise things because they don't have the ability to be self-sustaining. If as a teenager, let's say, you are dependent upon your parent to get you to and from, how do you learn to be independent of that relationship with your parent until you get a car? That's the problem there. If you're elderly, it's the same thing, but on the back end. You reach a point where your health and your circumstances don't allow you to drive anymore, and it puts you in a position where you are now, and you've invested into this suburban model, and it is for isolation as opposed to the opportunity of having some degree of independence, because without the car, if you need to get to a doctor's appointment, you can, you can hop on the bus or you can walk, or you need to get to the grocery store and you have the same options. The system that we have now is completely disconnected from those opportunities.
Yeah. And that's where that's where I went into housing plus transportation behaves like variable debt rates, right?
Yep.
And you called it blunt but accurate. You said that, income floats while costs anchor and raises don't restore equilibrium. I love the way you said that. They slow the bleed. And it's true, right? We've anchored one part of our lives, and yet we've created this variable debt rate on the other side. And now we're beholden to whatever from a business term, it would be operating expenses associated with where we are.
Yeah. Yeah. And that doesn't stop unless you can reframe your circumstances for day-to-day living. And that's a hard slog. We're not currently built for that, yet the market is screaming for it. And, I believe personally that the great opportunity that we have in front of us from a real estate standpoint is to invest in that pattern, the new pattern that's actually old.
Yeah.
It's going back to that.
Yeah, exactly. So much of looking forward requires us to look back. And that's where,
Yeah.
I always frame that as stable living. I think you see that. It's a hashtag that I use a lot. And
Yep.
really, what's ironic is that stability doesn't return by raising wages or building more units. Stability
No.
returns when you create less dependencies.
Yeah, well, I mean, using an economic framework, if you think about what I kind of drew out in terms of that idea of the conversion of time to money back to time, if you rework that from time back to money back to time at the front end, you've now changed the model, and you're in a much more, the outcomes are a lot more healthy when you're doing it at that front end. Right now, to do that, you have to be very committed to certain things, because that type of a development pattern and lifestyle are not in abundance, and so you do have to work a little harder. But there is tremendous value in doing that, because it does help to reset. And I think that at the level of the individual, I think that's the opportunity. And then working, working, working to the level of the neighborhood and the city, it's trying to work into a stretch to where it's less of a, there's less scarcity in that pattern and more abundance, because you're then stringing it together. And just like a set of pearls on a string, the benefit is in the whole of the necklace, as opposed to the individual pearl at that point.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And you mentioned that too in your book, and the great housing reversal twist, where you're talking about how we collectively, development has made attainable ownership geographically incompatible with the opportunity. We've clustered our opportunity in downtowns, but we've put the attainable at the edge, which means that we've got two choices at that point. We can either rent forever
Yep.
and not participate in what potentially could be our wealth building opportunity, or conversely, we can drive
But
our life away. We can drive our life away. And I love that paradox, because it really is. You also mentioned that there's a shift in the American dream, and that the kids, new young people, they're not interested in that model. They don't need the white picket fence and 2.5 kids and a Volvo and a Cape Cod house 25 or 35 or 45 miles outside of the city, right? They want that missing middle product, which a lot of people have a misnomer. They want that
yeah,
opportunity to live and work and walk to their life.
yeah. Well, and then they want that throughout their life cycle too. That's a very important part in this, Chris, is and it's one of those consequences of the current status quo pattern, is as your circumstances change over your life cycle, it forces you to have to relocate outside of the neighborhood that you've bought into. Readily have the ability to be able to say, my circumstances have changed, and I can actually find a type of housing that's down the street on the next block that will meet my needs, and I don't have to give up my neighborhood and community. You have to completely disconnect and go somewhere else and start over socially. That, I think, is problematic too. So for as part of that, as part of the next American dream, is the idea that the generations coming up behind us is Gen X, and what they are screaming for, that's part of it. They've experienced some of those things as children, and made the determination. I absolutely do not want to opt into that as an adult. I want greater stability over time, which means a neighborhood has to have those missing middle housing types that allow you to move within the neighborhood, as opposed to, having to completely relocate.
And I always sort of frame that I help build resilient communities. And that's part of how I frame that, is that you have a much better chance of resilience if you have diversity in any natural system. Biodiversity is
Yeah.
in and of itself, and distributed systems in and of themselves are more secure, more safe, more stable
Yeah.
than consolidated ones. One of the things that's super interesting as I continue to aspire to develop in more rural, small town America is that I'm noticing that most of the fragility comes into what you're calling points of failure, the housing typology. One 3-bedroom brick ranch house on 2 acres of land. And you can get any one you want as long as it's that. But there is no different typology or market mix that allows us to either laterally or upwardly move or even, revert, right? Every house is
Right.
the same.
Right. It forces compromise.
Yeah,
And I think we can do better.
right. And it's also when you look at life stages, part of what we're developing for right now with our civil servant model for pathway communities is upward mobility for those who serve. And it's really kind of bookends at the beginning of your career and at the end of your career. And at the beginning of your career, when you're a 22-year-old EMT or a 25-year-old nurse, you don't need to be cutting the lawn and emptying the gutters. Like that's going to end up becoming dad's problem or, a
Yeah.
neighbor's problem. You need to be living in a community and serving the community in which you live and focusing on getting your finances in order, stabilizing your finances so that when you're 30, which is most of our demographic numbers now, and you're considering potentially getting married and cohabitating or having kids, you've got 10 years that you've had that were stable living years where you've saved some money and now you can participate as a well qualified buyer. And that
Yeah.
simply doesn't exist right now. There's so much extraction in traditional NOI and rent models from 20 to 30. And the answer that we used to say is, well, I had to live in a shitty apartment too. And
Right.
that's fine, but we weren't getting out of school already cost burdened. Now
Right.
we're getting out of school already cost burdened and we're going into civil service. And civil service is not capitalism. You're never going to make a ton of money doing that job. You're there to serve your community. So it's fascinating to me how we can create resilience by creating diversity in product type and making that walkable so that we can cut back on the dependency of some of the other operating expenses associated with life.
Yeah. Well, and you think about how critical that civil service component is to the community. And the what I think everyone should want is they should want their civil servants actually embedded in their community as opposed to having to travel 30 minutes in because they can't even afford to live where they work. That's part of the challenge in that you're trying to correct for in these small towns that you're serving.
Yeah, and there's a responsible number of your gross rent, and the econometrics are pretty clear. Any certified financial planner will tell you that you're still in the responsible area if you're 25 to 28% of your gross rent going or gross income going to rent.
Yeah.
But if you get out of school, so if you make say $55,000 a year and you move into a home that's say $175,000, you're already cost burdened. If you add a car to that, or you add student debt to that,
Yep.
or you add, God forbid, childcare, your childcare is going to be more than your rent anyway. But if you just look at it traditionally as a debt burdened person that has school loans, you're already now out of money. So just at the very beginning of your career, now that you've gotten out of school and you're starting to work, you need a second job before you even get started. And what's scary to me, Mike, and I don't know if you've done these numbers, I've been pretty deep into area median income and average pay across the country. An EMT and a firefighter and a police officer and a nurse have a chance. You know who doesn't have a chance in America right now? Are school teachers. K through 12. The numbers that I'm seeing are staggering. I had no idea that they were as far behind in pay as they are, and in no way, shape, or form. And they have to wait 20 more years before they even get to a point where they can participate. Like they have to have subsidy. They have to be either married with a higher wage earner with them, or they've got to have parents who help right from the very start. Plus, they have to have their master's
Yeah,
degree. We're talking about making $45,000 a year out of school with a master's degree.
that doesn't
You know,
balance.
no, it doesn't balance. What we're doing is we're creating poverty. We're creating debt in that situation. And these are for people who we're entrusting with the education of our children. I want
Yeah,
my nurse to feel good if I'm sick, and I certainly want my firefighter to feel good if that person's responding to my home. But this is the future of our children and education, and that's K through 12. So,
yeah,
again, I don't want to sound like I'm bleeding heart here. This is just me reacting to the research that I've done nationally now. And by the way, it doesn't matter if you're in Connecticut or you're in Mississippi, because the area median income balances all of that back out. So if it costs more, you get paid more, but it's still, the ratio is still completely
right,
underrepresented. So,
right.
okay, so we pay our California teachers more than we do our Mississippi teachers, but it costs more in California to live. So it's the same ratio.
Yeah, so we have to. I mean, fortunately, we have folks like you that are willing to dig into this stuff, shed a light on it. It's then a question of what do we do about it? And I think from the standpoint of the spatial unbundling, I feel like what your listeners should understand is that the opportunities for change really starts at an incremental level, which is, again, what you're doing. You're working at an incremental level. We can't leave the solutions to institutional money and corporate home builders to fix the problem. They are gonna do what they do in terms of their business machine, and they will do it until the spigot gets shut off. I think the way to get them to steer their ship back around, which is going to be really slow, is for things to be demonstrated that they work outside of the status quo model. We have to do things that are going to stitch communities and neighborhoods back together for our physical, social, economic, environmental health, just across the board. Because what we're doing now, just it does not work. We have to, let's quit burying our heads in the sand, and let's understand that we have to fix the problem. And those that are willing to throw in their huge opportunity for it.
Huge. And it's because it's social solutions. It's restoring social contracts. So the benefit and the wellness side that we talked about this before we jumped on here real quick. I've said this so many times in the last couple of weeks, I can't even begin to explain it. Like, the reason that these projects don't pencil is because they're using the wrong pencil, first of all. And the
Yeah,
source funding won't allow for NOI or ROI for a traditional GPLP agreement where you've got a debt equity split for traditional infill market rate development. Doesn't work. Okay, great. And I have to harp on that a little bit, because even inside of the affordable housing model, you're seeing 40 and 50% of soft costs go to six-figure salaries across a very inefficient system, right?
yeah,
So
yeah,
this is where we got to in our conversations, and where I am in my research is looking at all the parts and pieces that do work, and looking at all the parts and pieces that don't work, and taking the good stuff and starting to put the puzzle back together. And that begs the sort of final question of the piece is, so how do we put it, if we're unbundling, how do we rebundle it? And you gave three very good systems that are currently fighting each other. So let's pack that back together. You say that code legalizes walkable mixed residential neighborhoods. Finance treats the patterns as normal, not exotic, and supports attainable home ownership and incremental development, and the delivery capacity that can produce these places repeatedly, not as one-off legacy or lifestyle projects, but as mainstream housing. So that's your solution. You said it so well: code, finance, and
yeah,
delivery capacity.
yeah. And I mean, it's easier said than done, but I think it's understanding that and you and I have had this conversation, if you don't have the ability to use the DNA of a walkable mixed use, mixed residential neighborhood, if that's not available, then you don't even have a place to start. So that has to come into play. You have to be able to fund development that will support that. And fortunately, and you correct me if I'm wrong on this, because maybe I'm being a little too aspirational and naive when I think this way, but it's my opinion that within the realm of the financial industry, if there's money to be made, money will be available to do things. So the money will happen if there's ability to use the code, and we've already established there's a market for it. The market is there. The problem is the market is having to make choices based on inferior selections that are available. So, we have to, it can't just be one thing. I mean, it's not just let's fix the code problem. Let's produce the DNA, because the DNA has to pair with the ability to lend, to construct under that DNA system. And currently, the way that institutional investors presently sit, they're not even looking in that direction.
No, this stuff
The
doesn't move the
money,
needle. What we're talking about
no,
doesn't move the needle. So,
no,
they're
I mean,
not in the business of solving problems either. They're in the business of capital
no,
market. So,
yeah,
you know,
prove the model and we'll be there. So the money has to come from sources that are closer to the ground, which is what you're experiencing. And then you have to have those that understand the connection of the first two. Code is there, the DNA is there, the finances are available, and then put the two to work to deliver neighborhood.
well, and that's the secret weapon that a lot of town managers don't realize they have the ability to do, is that the progressive town managers do. They're going back to their boards or their councils and they're saying, "Hey, look, we're not doing ourselves any favor by making this hard. We could be doing ourselves a favor by creating opportunity zones and then limiting certain scale and massing if that's what we want to do along the way. But let's clear the way for that first $700,000 worth of legal work that has to go through a rezoning just to get
Yeah,
something done right." That's where municipalities have so much power that they don't realize they have. Now, they're not in the business of developing, and they shouldn't be. They should not be
no,
asked to do it. But they can have they can have the listening sessions right now. They can go back to their boards and say, "Hey, listen, if we start to give some better density and create some cottage, some pocket neighborhoods that are walkable, we're going to get foot traffic, and that's probably going to lend itself to opportunities of economic investment because our shop owners are going to be happier."
yeah,
One thing that I wanted to point out that you said so well is what we really need to do first, like slowing down the steam engine or turning the cruise ship, is we have to stop adding penalties first, because the penalties are everywhere. The penalties are not only in for the developer or for the person who's speculative, but they're also for the owner, for the actual homeowner. There's penalties everywhere. So, like, let's stop penalizing the system first. Then let's look at code. Then let's find patient capital or aligned capital or appropriate capital. And by the way, start to pay attention to where impact capital is coming from. A lot of people are liking that word lately, kind of like fat free and like regenerative grass fed. Like impact capital is not all created equal. And then that the delivery capacity, the ability to create that repeatable, predictable, durable kit of parts through
yep,
construction science more so than one-off architecture is fascinating.
yeah, yeah. Solutions are there. You have certainly tapped into that, and it's really about tooling. We need dozens of you, Chris, not just one. We
I'm
need
trying.
dozens.
Listen, I can only you can't change the world by yourself, but you can
No,
start to change the people's view of the world, and
yes,
that helps.
Yes.
and I know it's coming. I can feel it. So I want to read
Yeah.
the end of your piece here, and then I want to let you kind of respond because I said we would be about 30 minutes, and I know you're in the middle of a move. Thank you for taking the time. You say if we want to rebuild a durable American middle, we have to stop treating housing as a commodity category and start treating it for what it really is, the platform on which family stability, time, belonging, and opportunity either compound or decay. We didn't merely unbundle the middle, we zoned it apart, financed it into fragility, and paved the distance between its parts. That's beautiful, man. There's a chef's kiss there because now we've defined the problem. So all we have to do is reverse engineer it, start backwards and read that backwards, and you've got the answer.
Yeah. Well, and we have to, going back to I guess, looking at it from the standpoint of the individual, we have to make a determination as to whether we're willing to opt in, and if we are, how we're going to do that. It doesn't require everybody to go out and start building houses. There's a lot of opportunity for that, but it's also, and this kind of goes back to where we started, Chris, is being willing to show up at a city council meeting and bark about we need to do things different and we need to do things better. But if we're living under the strain of the system as it's currently built, that's hard to do. But that's part of opting in to say, I want to be part of the solution, so that, and even if it's, you think of it in terms of investing for the next generation, so that they don't have to deal with what we've had to deal with. That's a worthy enough cause in and of itself.
Yeah. And we're seeing, so, just as a shout out, I'm working on a project up in Newcastle, Maine, Newcastle Damascotta, where they have a vision plan that hasn't been kind of updated in some years. And they're hosting listening sessions right now. They're proactively trying to sort of forward zone for the future and asking the community what's important to them. And then holding it back instead of saying, hey, we're going to redevelop and rezone and do this. They're saying, what should we do? We need to serve our constituents, but we also need to be forward thinking and serve our future residents, because we don't want to age out and have one typology and have one demographic. And then all of a sudden nobody's here. The last
Right.
person turned off the light. So that forward thinking programming and development of future thinking can happen and really should be. I encourage every small town in America right now to be having this discussion, because you can attract so much good quality customer profiling, if that's what you want to call it, or solutions based folks to your area if you just make it easier to come in and build that missing middle product with unencumbered code and better financing.
I'm going to give you a really quick geeky answer to kind of bolt on to what you just described. What you talked about with Maine spurred a thought with me, and I've been playing with these concepts for a while now. The first is, as you're going through that process, in my opinion, the model to really be using to do that is to look at Simon Sinek's golden circle, identifying the why, then the how, then the what.
Mm-hmm.
The second is to then think of things in terms of being solutions based, thinking in terms of what Nassim Taleb talks about in his book Anti-Fragile, where you're trying to define fragility versus resilience versus anti-fragility.
Mm-hmm.
The top of the mountain is to have an anti-fragile system,
Mm-hmm.
that as things get difficult, you don't just make it through the storm, you come out the other side actually stronger.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way our communities need to be functioning.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the municipal government really needs to think about how they go through these steps that you're describing in Maine. A little food for thought in terms of places to look in terms of developing a strategy.
Yeah, and I thank you, and I have considered that. I'm an avid reader. There's also a thought that comes to my mind, Michael Easter's book, Scarcity Brain. He goes into gear versus stuff. So much of what we carry with us is stuff. but we're not thinking about it in terms of gear. So we talked about how we get caught in our OpEx. We get caught in a lot of this instability because of the stuff that we're carrying along with us, whether it's paying for car and insurance or whatever we're doing, drive time. But, looking at the way that we acquire things as gear or stuff is very interesting too, because it gives us that ability to put those things to use as tools. So, Mike, you're the current director of pre-development, high street real estate, and your book is The Great Housing Reversal. Where can folks find you?
Boy, I think I would say my professional home base is LinkedIn. I've gotten into a rhythm of posting articles every Monday and Thursday on LinkedIn as I'm actually trying to further develop the idea of the great housing reversal and thinking of it in terms of delivery, because what I did with that book was really, the way I tell people about it is it was kind of my Jerry Maguire manifesto. Uh, and I need to put more substance to it. It's like if someone were to read my book and say, yeah, this makes a lot of sense, but what do I do with it? There's not a lot of meat on the bone. So I'm trying to, as I write these articles, I'm trying to develop the means for delivery. And I don't know, maybe at some point I do a follow-up book that has much deeper substance to explaining what the process for delivery of the great housing reversal can and should be.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your open source perspective. I'm a big fan of open source. I'm building out loud as well. I don't feel like
Yeah,
anything that I'm doing is proprietary. It still has to be built. It's still the hard work has to be
right.
done.
Yeah,
So that open source, decentralized physical infrastructure perspective is appreciated. So, well, next month, the topic for my Substack is going to be housing as infrastructure, not as an asset class. So we'll have a good time going into that, I think. And, we hit on a little bit of that today. So I can't
yeah.
remember who my guest is. Otherwise I would go ahead and plug who that is now, but I've got to get busy writing because whether you like it or not, next week is March. So February is already behind us, my friend.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate you playing along with this. It was great. I will make sure that there's links to everything, my original article, your follow-up article, your book, your LinkedIn. This was great. Thanks for taking a minute and going live.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. This was actually very enjoyable. I appreciate the opportunity that you gave me.
Yeah, you bet, man. Well, thanks again.